They called it the Pacific, but there was nothing peaceful about it. 1,000 islands scattered across an ocean so vast it could swallow entire fleets. Every wave hit a minefield, every coral reef could slice through steel, and every island, no matter how small, was soaked in blood. To the Japanese, the Pacific was home, a defensive ring fortified by airfields, bunkers, and gun batteries that stretched from the Philippines to the Marianas. They believed it would take a century for any enemy to break through. They called it the Steel Wall of the East. But in 1943, the Americans stopped trying to go through it and decided to go around it. Led by admirals like Chester Nimitz and Raymond Spruance, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps began an audacious new plan. Leapfrog across the Pacific, island by island, capturing only the ones that mattered and leaving the rest to die on the vine. It was a strategy built on logic, deception, and speed, one the Japanese never saw coming. And by the time they understood it, it was already too late. This is the story of the U.S. Navy's island-hopping strategy, how America turned the Pacific Ocean itself into a weapon, and how an empire built on expansion collapsed one island at a time.
Act 1. The Wall of the Rising Sun. This act introduces Japan's Pacific Empire, its confidence, its fortifications, and the illusion of invincibility that blinded its leaders to the coming shift in strategy. By early 1942, Japan ruled the Pacific like a kingdom without end. From Burma to the Marshall Islands, its empire stretched across millions of square miles, the largest expansion in its history. At the heart of it were the Imperial Japanese Navy and the army garrisons that turned islands into fortresses. Each one was armed with artillery, fuel depots, aircraft shelters, and thousands of men sworn to fight to the last. The strategy was simple: make invasion too costly to attempt. Every reef and beach was mined. Every ridge became a gun nest. If America wanted to cross the Pacific, it would have to fight for every inch. Tokyo believed time was its greatest ally. They thought the Americans would break themselves on these rocks, as they had at Bataan, as they had at Wake Island, as they had at Guadalcanal. But what Japan didn't understand was that the U.S. Navy was learning faster than they were rebuilding. Behind the scenes, Admiral Nimitz was studying something Japan never expected: the map itself. He saw the Pacific not as a wall, but as a network. And he realized that Japan's strength, its wide defensive perimeter, was also its greatest weakness. The empire had stretched itself too thin. There weren't enough ships to protect every island, not enough planes to cover every sky. The Japanese had built a fortress, but one too large to guard. And so the Americans prepared a new kind of war, one not of confrontation, but of selection. They would not storm every beach. They would choose which islands to take and which to starve. It was war as mathematics, war as geometry, war as evolution. The Japanese didn't yet know it, but their empire had just become a maze, and the Americans were about to skip every dead end.
Act 2. Leaping across the Blue Inferno. This act explores how America's new island-hopping plan took shape, bypassing heavily defended strongholds to strike at Japan's weak points, shocking the enemy and redefining modern warfare. In the spring of 1943, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps began a campaign unlike any before it, not of brute force, but of precision. It was called Operation Cartwheel, and its purpose was both brilliant and cruel: to strangle Japan's empire island by island, one vein at a time. The idea came from a simple question asked in the Pacific Fleet's strategy room: why storm every fortress when you can let it die alone? Instead of attacking every garrison, the Americans would skip the most fortified islands, Rabaul, Truk, Palau, and others, and seize only the airfields and harbors that could project power forward. Each captured island would become a springboard, a floating base of aircraft, fuel, and artillery, inching ever closer to Japan. The strategy was as much psychological as it was tactical. The Japanese High Command, obsessed with honor and defense, could not comprehend abandoning strongholds. Their generals swore to hold every island until death. But death was exactly what came, slowly, silently, from the sea. While Japanese forces dug in for invasions that never came, the Americans simply went around them. They built new runways, launched new bombers, and let the isolated garrisons starve. One U.S. officer later said, "We didn't need to kill them all. We just needed to make their islands disappear." It was warfare turned inside out, a game of patience and precision in an ocean of chaos. At the heart of it were the Seabees, the U.S. Navy's construction battalions. Wherever Marines landed, the Seabees followed, building airstrips out of coral in days, roads through jungles in hours, and harbors where none had existed before. They worked under fire, sweating through tropical heat and mortar bursts, turning uninhabited atolls into fortresses overnight. By the end of 1943, the results were undeniable. The Japanese garrisons on bypassed islands began running out of food. Entire units resorted to fishing or cannibalism. Their radios fell silent. Their officers stopped reporting. They had been cut off, not by bombs, but by strategy. The Japanese called it kiri otoshi, the cutting away. But by the time they named it, it was already devouring them. And somewhere in the Pacific night, as American ships steamed toward another invisible island on the horizon, a young Marine leaned against the deck rail and whispered, "They'll never see us coming." He was right.
Act 3. The Floating Cities of War. This act reveals how America's aircraft carriers, supply fleets, and mobile bases turned the ocean itself into a moving fortress, enabling the island-hopping strategy to outpace anything Japan could imagine. The success of island hopping depended on one revolutionary idea: mobility, not of men, but of entire worlds. While Japan built immovable fortresses of coral and concrete, the U.S. Navy built floating ones. Aircraft carriers, repair ships, and floating docks that could move anywhere, refuel anywhere, and strike anywhere. It was the birth of a concept the world had never seen: the mobile war machine. By mid-1943, the Americans had turned the Pacific into a living organism. Massive Essex-class carriers sailed with fleets of destroyers, tankers, and supply ships, a moving city of metal and men that could travel thousands of miles without touching land. Every carrier was a floating airfield. Every ship had a purpose, from hospitals to ammunition depots to bakeries that baked 10,000 loaves of bread a day. To the Japanese, this was unthinkable. Their navy had been built for decisive battles, one grand clash to determine supremacy. But the Americans didn't play by those rules anymore. They didn't need ports or bases. They brought their own. Admiral Nimitz's genius lay in synchronization. He coordinated fleets, carriers, and amphibious landings like clockwork, supported by an endless stream of logistics from the mainland. The U.S. Navy's new underway replenishment system, refueling and resupplying ships while at sea, turned the Pacific into an American highway. Japan's empire, once stretched proudly across the ocean, was now being outpaced by one that never stopped moving. Each captured island became another node in this growing network. The Gilbert Islands fed the Marshalls fed the Marianas. From each new base, American aircraft reached farther, faster, deeper, bombing supply lines, intercepting convoys, and strangling Japan's communication routes. To the Japanese soldiers trapped on bypassed islands, the war began to feel like a vanishing dream. Their radios grew silent, their skies filled with bombers. They could no longer tell where the Americans would strike next, only that they always came, like a storm rolling from horizon to horizon. And beneath it all, the ocean itself had turned against them, no longer a moat of defense, but a highway of invasion. "We used to own the sea," a Japanese admiral said later. "Then one day, we realized the sea belonged to them."
Act 4, The Leap to the Marianas. This act chronicles the pivotal moment when the island-hopping strategy struck Japan's heartline, the capture of the Marianas Islands, which brought the U.S. bombing force within range of Tokyo and shattered Japan's illusion of distance. By the summer of 1944, the ocean war had turned into a race, and the Americans were winning. Every island taken, every runway built, every mile gained brought the war closer to Japan's doorstep. The next leap was the boldest yet, the Marianas Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. To the Japanese, these were sacred strongholds, the last great wall before the home islands. From their airfields, Japanese bombers could still reach the Pacific Fleet. From their cliffs, they believed they could see the Empire's sunrise. But to the Americans, they were something far more strategic, stepping stones to Tokyo. Admiral Nimitz called it the key to the Pacific Gate. If they could seize the Marianas, the new B-29 Superfortress bombers could reach Japan itself. And so, in June 1944, the Pacific roared to life. The invasion began with the thunder of naval guns, the largest bombardment in the Pacific to date. Thousands of shells rained down on Saipan as Marines surged ashore under a burning sky. The beaches erupted in fire, coral sand turning crimson as Japanese artillery opened up from caves and bunkers. The battle was brutal, one of the bloodiest in the Pacific. The defenders fought to the death, using suicide charges, hidden tunnels, and even civilians forced into hopeless defense. But the Americans pressed forward, inch by inch, jeep by jeep, flame by flame. By the end of June, Saipan fell, then Tinian, then Guam. And when it was over, the cost was staggering. Nearly 30,000 Japanese dead, including entire families who had chosen death over surrender. But with their fall came a seismic shift. American engineers moved in instantly, carving airstrips from jungle and coral in record time. Within weeks, the first B-29 bombers began arriving, silver giants gleaming under the Pacific sun. From those runways, the U.S. could now reach Japan directly. Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, no longer distant names on a map, but targets within hours. The Japanese commanders had believed the Pacific would protect them, but the ocean that once kept invaders out now carried them in, wave after wave, island after island, until the empire itself stood exposed. When word of the Marianas' fall reached Tokyo, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned. The empire had lost not just islands, it had lost its shield. And somewhere across the dark Pacific, Admiral Nimitz looked at the new flight paths stretching from the Marianas to Japan and said quietly, "Now the war can end."
Act 5. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. This act captures the decisive air battle that proved the island-hopping strategy's true power. When American naval aviators annihilated Japan's last great carrier air fleet and shattered its control of the Pacific skies. The capture of the Marianas did more than bring America closer to Japan. It set the stage for one of the most one-sided battles in aviation history. On June 19, 1944, as the U.S. invasion of Saipan raged on, Admiral Soemu Toyoda of the Imperial Japanese Navy ordered Operation A-Go, a desperate counterattack meant to crush the American fleet once and for all. Japan threw everything it had left into the fight: 9 aircraft carriers, over 400 planes, and the remnants of its once unstoppable navy. But what awaited them was not the same enemy they had faced at Pearl Harbor or Coral Sea. The U.S. Navy of 1944 was faster, sharper, and armed with new technology: radar-guided defenses, experienced pilots, and a vast carrier force led by Admiral Raymond Spruance and Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. As the Japanese planes approached the American fleet north of the Marianas, the sky became a battlefield. Wave after wave of enemy aircraft dove in from the horizon, and wave after wave vanished under the fire of American fighters and anti-aircraft guns. From the carrier decks of the USS Lexington, Yorktown, and Enterprise, American pilots roared into the air in Grumman F-6F Hellcats, intercepting the enemy long before they could strike. Radar gave them eyes beyond the clouds. Discipline gave them precision. Within minutes, the sky over the Philippine Sea turned into a storm of smoke, tracers, and falling wings. So many Japanese planes were shot down that American pilots began to call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By the end of the day, the numbers were staggering. Over 350 Japanese planes destroyed, for the loss of barely 30 American aircraft. The Imperial Navy's air arm, once the terror of the Pacific, had been obliterated. One U.S. pilot radioed back in disbelief. It was like swatting flies with a sledgehammer. The sea below was littered with burning wreckage, parachutes, and oil slicks stretching for miles. The surviving Japanese carriers fled under the cover of darkness, their decks nearly empty. In Tokyo, silence filled the war rooms. The last true hope of Japanese air power had vanished. From that moment on, the Pacific belonged to the Americans. No longer would the Japanese fleet threaten the advance. No longer would the ocean be their defense. The skies, the very element that once carried Japan's dreams of domination, now belonged to the enemy. The island-hopping campaign had just reached its climax. A war won not through numbers, but through adaptation, innovation, and overwhelming skill. The Empire had built its wall of islands, and the Americans had flown right over it.
Act 6. The Ghost Islands. This act explores the haunting aftermath of island hopping, the fate of the Japanese soldiers left behind on bypassed islands, isolated, starving, and forgotten as the war moved beyond them. While the great fleets clashed in the skies over the Marianas, hundreds of miles away, thousands of Japanese soldiers sat waiting for battles that would never come. They were the garrisons, men stationed on the islands the Americans had deliberately skipped. Places like Rabaul, Wake, Truk Lagoon, and Kavieng. Once proud fortresses of the Empire, now cut off from the world. When the U.S. Navy began its island-hopping campaign, these bases had been bypassed, surrounded, isolated, and left to rot. No ships came to resupply them. No planes came to their aid. No orders arrived from Tokyo. The ocean that once brought glory now became a cage. At first, they held their discipline. Officers made the men drill, maintain defenses, and prepare for invasions that never came. But as months turned to years, discipline eroded into despair. Food ran out. Ammunition dwindled. Radios fell silent.
Some garrisons tried to grow crops or fish. Others dug deep wells and scavenged rainwater. Many simply starved. On Wake Island, Japanese troops resorted to hunting seabirds for survival. On Rabaul, an entire army of more than 90,000 men faded into the jungle, forgotten by both sides. And on the smaller islands, names barely known even to their own maps, hundreds of men lived out their final days speaking to ghosts. Occasionally, an American plane would pass overhead, and the soldiers would raise their rifles in salute, not to fight, but to be remembered. One Japanese diary, later recovered from an abandoned bunker, read only, "The sea no longer brings ships. The sky no longer brings orders. We have become shadows." The island-hopping strategy hadn't just defeated Japan's armies, it had erased them. Without firing a single shot, the Americans had turned entire garrisons into silent prisons. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, some of these isolated soldiers still didn't know the war was over. They emerged years later, thin, ragged, bewildered, men who had survived on seaweed and faith. The empire that once dreamed of eternal rule had been reduced to whispers on forgotten shores. And the soldiers who once shouted "Banzai" into the ocean now listened only to the waves.
Act 7. The Path to Japan. This act reveals how the island-hopping campaign brought the war directly to Japan's doorstep, setting the stage for the final assaults on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and sealing the empire's fate. By late 1944, the Pacific had become an American highway. Each island seized, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Peleliu, was another rung on a ladder climbing toward Japan. The U.S. Navy's floating cities advanced relentlessly, and behind them followed the Seabees, carving airfields from coral as fast as the map could change. Japan's vast empire, once sprawling and invincible, was now a chain of crumbling bones. The Philippines fell. The Marianas were gone. Formosa and the Ryukyus stood next, and beyond them, the home islands. The final path was clear, but it was paved with fire. In February 1945, the island of Iwo Jima became the next target. Just 750 miles from Tokyo, it was a volcanic fortress bristling with tunnels, bunkers, and heavy guns, the forward eyes of Japan's homeland defense. To the Americans, it was essential. Its airfields could serve as emergency landing strips for B-29 bombers and as fighter escort bases for the raids to come. On February 19th, the Marines hit the beaches and stepped straight into hell. The Japanese had learned from every battle before. They no longer defended the beaches, they defended the depths. They waited underground, in honeycombs of tunnels carved into Mount Suribachi. For 36 days, Iwo Jima burned. Each inch of black volcanic sand was paid for in blood. More than 6,800 Americans died there. Nearly 21,000 Japanese fought to the last. Only a few hundred surrendered. When it was over, the image of Marines raising the flag on Suribachi became immortal, a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and the terrible price of progress. But the road did not end there. In April 1945, the Americans turned to Okinawa, the final step before Japan itself. What awaited them was beyond imagination. Kamikaze waves, typhoons of artillery, civilians caught between two empires' fury. It was the bloodiest battle of the Pacific. Nearly 200,000 dead on both sides. The Japanese fought not for victory, but for meaning,
to show that invasion would be unbearable. And they succeeded. Okinawa was both triumph and warning. By its end, Japan was surrounded, its navy destroyed, its skies burning, and its soldiers, once proud guardians of the Pacific, were now defenders of ash. The Americans had not conquered every island, only those that mattered. The rest lay silent, cut off, starving, irrelevant. The genius of island hopping was complete. The road to Japan had been carved not with size or strength, but with strategy. And now that road led directly to the empire's heart.
Act 8. The Empire Falls. This act depicts the unraveling of the Japanese Empire as the island-hopping campaign reaches its final crescendo. How relentless pressure from sea and sky turned Japan's strength into ruin and its pride into surrender. By the summer of 1945, Japan was dying by inches. The empire that once stretched across the Pacific had withered to a handful of smoldering islands. The war that began with 1,000 victories now clung to the hope of one impossible miracle. From the airfields of Tinian and Guam, the new B-29 superfortresses rose like flocks of silver giants. Their engines thundered across the Pacific, carrying not just bombs, but the weight of an industrial nation's vengeance. Night after night, they painted Japan's skies in flame. Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe. Cities turned to cinders by firestorms that devoured everything. The Japanese people looked up and saw the end coming not from soldiers or fleets, but from clouds of steel. The skies, once their shield, had become their executioner. And below those skies, the U.S. Navy's island-hopping strategy had achieved its masterpiece. From the captured islands, Iwo Jima, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, and Okinawa, the Americans could strike anywhere, anytime. The Pacific, once a vast expanse of protection, had been transformed into a launch pad for total annihilation. The Japanese High Command tried to fight back, but it was like throwing pebbles at a hurricane. Their remaining airfields were craters. Their ships were wrecks. Their pilots, many barely trained, now flew one-way missions as kamikaze. In Tokyo's underground bunkers, officers still drew lines on maps, planning counterattacks that would never happen. But Admiral Nimitz's war was not about maps anymore. It was about erasure, the systematic dismantling of Japan's empire, one coordinate at a time. Each island lost was not just a defeat, it was the loss of fuel, food, communication, and faith. By July 1945, entire garrisons had ceased reporting. The Japanese soldiers on bypassed islands, once warriors of the emperor, now scavenged for roots and rainwater. And then came the unthinkable. On August 6th, a single B-29, the Enola Gay, flew from Tinian and dropped the world's first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another bomb fell on Nagasaki. The shockwaves were more than physical, they were psychological. For the first time in history, the empire that believed itself divine faced the undeniable truth of human limitation. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito spoke to his people, his voice trembling over the radio. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. And with those words, centuries of imperial silence broke. The Japanese soldiers who had sworn to die for the empire now laid down their arms. Some wept, some bowed, some simply stared into the sea that had once carried their empire and now reflected its ashes. The island-hopping strategy had done more than defeat Japan. It had redefined warfare. It proved that the battlefield could move, that geography could be weaponized, and that no fortress, no matter how strong, could withstand a mind that refused to fight on its terms. The empire of the rising sun had fallen, not in a single blow, but in 1,000 quiet leaps across the sea.
Act 9. The Lessons of the Pacific.
This act reflects on what the island-hopping campaign taught the world, not just about war, but about adaptation, intelligence, and the human cost of innovation. When the guns finally went silent, the Pacific was no longer a frontier, it was a graveyard. Thousands of islands lay scarred with craters, wreckage, and bones. The coral reefs glittered with shrapnel. The jungles whispered with ghosts. But amid the ruin, something profound had changed. The island-hopping campaign had rewritten the Book of War. It taught that mobility was power, not size, that strategy could defeat stubbornness, that brains could outlast brutality. The Americans hadn't conquered every island. They didn't need to. They had learned to make the ocean itself an ally, to turn distance into deception, and to let patience win where pride could not. The Japanese High Command never fully grasped what had happened until it was over. They had built an empire of walls, fortresses, bunkers, bastions, all rooted in the old world's logic. But the Americans had fought a war of movement, the war of the modern age. Each leap forward, from Tarawa to Saipan, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa, was a lesson in precision. Each bypassed island was proof that not every fight needs to be fought to be won. And yet every victory came at a cost, one that can't be measured in maps or medals. The beaches of the Pacific ran red with the blood of men who never came home. The jungles still hide the rusting helmets of those who did not surrender. The sea still holds the bones of ships and sailors who vanished between tides. For the Marines who landed first and the Seabees who built under fire, the war didn't feel like a strategy. It felt like chaos, like fear and duty stitched together with grit. Years later, one Marine wrote in his diary, "We didn't think about the big picture. We just knew we had to get to the next island because that's where our buddies were." But when historians looked back, they saw the genius behind that relentless drive. They saw how Admiral Nimitz, General MacArthur, and countless unknown planners had turned the Pacific, once a map of Japanese dominance, into a staircase to peace. And that's the paradox of the island-hopping campaign. It was a masterpiece of strategy built on unimaginable sacrifice, a triumph of human ingenuity shadowed by the human cost of its success. The Pacific War ended not just with surrender, but with revelation. That empires built on conquest always fall. That technology without humanity leads to ruin. And that victory means little unless it remembers the dead who made it possible.
Act 10. Echoes of the Ocean. Final reflection and call to action. This final act closes the story with Hidden Frontline's signature cinematic tone. Solemn, reflective, and emotionally resonant. It connects the courage and innovation of the Pacific War to timeless lessons about humanity, resilience, and remembrance. When the tides returned to peace, the Pacific became quiet again. But if you stand on those islands today, the same beaches where men once fought and fell, you can still feel the echoes beneath your feet. The coral reefs still bear the scars of bombardment. The jungles still hide rusted helmets and fragments of uniforms. The ocean, calm and endless, still whispers the same sound it did in 1944, the sound of men moving forward into the unknown. America's island-hopping campaign wasn't just a military strategy. It was a reflection of the human spirit, the ability to adapt, to endure, to think beyond fear. Each leap across the Pacific wasn't just a move on a map. It was a choice to rise above destruction, to turn adversity into advantage. It showed the world that wars aren't won by power alone, but by imagination, by those who dare to see differently when others see only walls. For the Japanese soldiers left stranded on forgotten islands, for the Marines who never saw home again, for the Seabees who built airfields in fire and coral, for every sailor who vanished beneath those blue waves. Their stories still belong to us, because history isn't just about how nations fought, it's about why they fought and what they learned. And if the Pacific War taught anything, it's that even the vastest oceans can be crossed if you have the courage to take the next leap. So remember the islands, remember the names, remember the men. They built bridges of blood and steel across the sea, and from their sacrifice rose a new world, one built not on conquest, but on connection. The war ended, but its lessons live on. And somewhere across the endless blue horizon, you can still hear the whisper of engines, the hum of courage that refuses to die. They called it island hopping, but it was more than a strategy. It was a journey through fire and fear, across oceans that tested everything human in us. From the beaches of Tarawa to the skies above Tokyo, it proved one truth, that courage, when guided by wisdom, can move mountains, or in this case, entire seas. This is Hidden Frontlines, where the echoes of war still speak, and the lessons of history still guide us forward. Subscribe, remember, and never stop crossing the oceans within yourself.